Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
On this episode of the Sumud podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Palestinian-American Zeina Azzam. Zeina is a poet, writer, editor, and community activist who is currently the Poet Laureate of the City of Alexandria, Virginia. Her poetry explores themes of war and displacement, the refugee and immigrant experience, and navigating multiple cultures, languages, and identities. Her articles and poems have appeared in Al Jazeera English, The Hill, Huffington Post, Mondwise, and many more.
And we are your hosts at Hasan and Zeina Ashrawi. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you watch or listen, and follow us on social media, either on @SumudPod or @SumudPodcast. Zeina, it is such an honor and a pleasure to have you on. You know, other than me being a huge fan of your poetry, I do have to disclose that we are cousins, distant cousins, if you will. I think your grandmother and my father's grandmother are sisters. So there's that connection. And I grew up with your niece and nephew in Ramallah, in Palestine, for many years. You know, we were playing in the backyard of our home in Ramallah. So our connections run deep, but you and I got to know each other as adults, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. Welcome to the podcast, Zeina.
Thank you so much for inviting me, for wanting to include my voice in your series. I'm such a fan of both of you, of this podcast. I actually watched a few podcasts before coming on, and you're doing amazing work and uplifting and amplifying important voices. And I'm just humbled that you wanted to include mine.
We're gonna make that into a clip just because she said that. I'm gonna make sure to make that into a clip.
Yeah, and on the topic of family, you know, and both of our grandparents were from Nasra, from Nazareth. We would love to hear more about your family. You know, you talk a lot about being refugees and coming from Palestine. Tell us more about your family's background from Nasra.
Sure. I'll preface that with saying that whenever I would actually visit Palestine, or at least Jerusalem and the West Bank, I would stay with your grandmother, Auntie Salwa. So it's very special. She was a very special person to me. And I happened to be in Palestine when she passed away and was able to go to her funeral, which was amazing to me. And I brought my daughter with me at that time. So the family we do have deep roots together. So my parents, as you mentioned, Zeina, are from Nazareth, both of them. And they married in Palestine. They moved to Haifa in the 40s after they were married. So they were living there during the beginning of the Nakba. And so they and pretty much everybody else in my family fled at that time in 48. So they first went to Lebanon for a few days, a few months in Beirut, and my father wasn't able to find work. And so they then moved. And this is my mother, my father, and my oldest brother, who was born in 46 in Palestine. So they moved to Syria, where my aunt, my mother's sister, Khalti, was married to a Syrian man from Homs, actually. And so she was living in Homs with him. And so my parents went there so they could start a new life and look for work there. And my father started a small business, and they lived there. My brother Fatih was born in Homs, and then so was I. And so I have Syria as my birthplace in my passport. When I was 2 years old, my father found a job in Beirut, in UNRWA actually. And so we moved to Beirut when I was 2. And we stayed there until I was 10 years old. So I had my childhood basically in Beirut. Of course, my first language is Arabic, and I have lots of fond memories from Beirut. We used to always visit Syria. We'd visit my aunt at that time. So really, Lebanon and Syria were very figural in my childhood. We immigrated to the U.S. when I was 10. My grandparents had come here before, and we stayed with them for a few months. We were very much, sort of that true idea of an immigrant. We came with very little in our pockets and to start a whole new life. Amazingly, my grandparents were living in Iowa in this little tiny farming town. And so my mother, my brother Fatih, and I actually stayed with them the first few months of our time in the US. So that was my introduction to US culture. My father stayed on the East Coast looking for work. He was in New York City for a while and he didn't find anything. And then he decided to go up to the capital of New York, which is Albany. And so he went there and we ended up going East Coast to Albany. And my grandparents came with us. My grandfather found work in Albany. He was actually a physician, and he found a job at Albany Medical Center. So we all lived together for a few months in a house in a suburb of Albany. And then my grandfather and my grandmother moved into their own place, and we stayed in Del Mar, New York. So that's where I had my teen years, from 11 years until 17, until I went to college. So during that time, there was the Vietnam War. There was a lot of upheaval in the world, as always, of course. And my mother became active in ADC, actually. She was the chapter coordinator for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. So had a little bit of, awakening, certainly politically in terms of Vietnam. My brother Fatih was very active in the movement, and I would go with him to demonstrations against the war. And then during my high school years, there was Watergate. And so, there was just a lot of political upheaval in this country at that time. There was a very small Arab American community in upstate New York, so we didn't have a huge community, but we found each other. And then I went to college, and I was the only Palestinian on campus. And so I look often at the college students these days and how, they have a cohort of people who work with them politically, who can discuss things with them politically. They can evolve politically, right? And I didn't have that. And it felt like, when I look back at my life, it felt like a deficit. So it was really after college that I could become politically involved more. Of course, I was always aware of everything. I was always reading and keeping up with everything. And so after college, I moved to Boston with a girlfriend from college, and we lived together for a couple of years, and she got married and I lived by myself. I worked for an educational consulting firm. And then I just was really itching to do work that combined my identity as an Arab, as a Palestinian, and my identity as an American. I felt like I was both. I was very much bicultural, bilingual. And I started thinking about coming to Washington, D.C., and I came down and stayed with a friend, and I applied for a job at the Arab League, the League of Arab States, in 1980. And they took me, and so I moved to D.C., and I worked as a secretary for the Arab League. I had my BA. I studied psychology, and I didn't minor in music, but because we didn't have minors, we just had, and I couldn't double major, but I took a lot of music classes. So I had these interests in my background, but I wanted a foot in the door. So I started working at the Arab League, and I was there about 5 months, and I really didn't like it. It was a very patriarchal, and it was not a situation I really wanted to be in. So I started looking for other work. At the same time, I learned about the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University and the MA program they have in Arab Studies. And I thought this would be a really great move for me, is to pursue an MA in Arab Studies and really build on my background and my interests and I was feeling really very much an activist when I came to DC. I remember attending many things. I attended the ADC meetings. They were at the AUG. There are all these things happening in DC at that time. So I applied for the MA in Arab Studies, and I got accepted, but they put me as an alternate on the scholarships list. And I was already paying my huge debt from undergraduate school. And I just had made a pact with myself that I wasn't going to go to graduate school unless I had a scholarship. And so I got to know the administrators at Georgetown. And one of them called me up and said, we have a position at the Center for Arab Studies. And if you work here, after a year, you get free tuition. And so I applied for the job and I got it. And I have to say that move was just very life-changing for me, because I ended up starting to work at the Arab Studies Center at Georgetown in 1980. And I worked there for 27 years. So it was really quite figural in my professional life on many levels. And I had different jobs there as I went along. And so it was pretty amazing. I did not end up doing the MA in Arab Studies. I realized that many of the people who were doing MAs in the field at that time got jobs sort of like what I already had there. Although I think the MA program there has changed considerably and it's become much more academic and people go on for PhDs. But at that time, it was characterized as sort of a terminal degree. And so people went on to do journalism, or they went on to do School of Foreign Service work, the actual in the field in the Foreign Service. But I did end up later on doing an MA in sociology at George Mason University. And I could go on and on about this whole thing, but I ended up doing a second MA later on, which I could tell you about as we get on with I know I'm telling you too much.
There's no such thing. We love it. Keep going. That's amazing. It's truly, documentation of your life. So please keep going.
Well, thank you. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary, the Center for Arab Studies, next year, because it was established in 1975. And so they're doing an oral history. And I was just interviewed for that as well, because I was there for 27 years of the 50. And so, in 1986, I had my first child and I didn't want to work full time. I mean, it was more than full time, right? I was working 50, 60 hours a week. It was just one of those jobs. And so I really wanted to scale back. And so I ended up just working there for 30 hours a week, doing some of the things that I used to do, especially fundraising. I also got into publications work, and I got a certificate in publications and editing from George Washington University, and could apply those skills to the books and the papers that I was editing and producing for the center. In 1988, I decided to move on. So I was actually there for 8 years, from 80 to 88. And I went on to do my master's in sociology. I had my second child in 1990. I was doing some part-time work and consulting and being home with my children. And then in 1994, it was time for me to do something more formal work-wise. We needed me to work. So I was looking for part-time work. And the director of the center called me and said that they had a part-time position there. And so I went back to the Center for Arab Studies. And it was a hard decision. I felt like I was sort of going backward in my professional career, but the place has always been in my heart, really, for the center. I really believe in the work that the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies does. So I went back and I was working 15 hours a week. And what helped make it go full time is that we received funding from the Department of Education. We became a national resource center on the Middle East. So there are, NRCs, National Resource Centers, on different regional studies programs, 4 different regional studies programs throughout the country at different universities. And so Georgetown became one on the Middle East. And the U.S. Department of Education put a high premium on outreach work. And I was sending people into the schools, our students, to speak in the schools. I was helping write curriculum materials. And at that time, there was a burgeoning field in all of the regional studies programs, and particularly in the Middle East. So that was, just a really exciting time at the center too, as we were growing, and I had more faculty, had more scholarship aid. And our MA in Arab Studies program really grew as well. So while I was there, I decided to start taking classes in Arabic. We came here when I was 10 years old, so my Arabic ability was very much a young, as a young child. Although I did take classes in college, but there weren't that many. I took the highest, I took Arabic 3, and it was just too easy for me, and there was nothing else. And so I always had felt a real sort of deficit that I couldn't read literary Arabic well, and Georgetown has this amazing Arabic department. So I started taking classes in Arabic literature. And I took one in like grammar and writing first. And I could do that because I worked there and I knew all the faculty, and I was able to take their classes. And so after taking like 4 classes in the Arabic department, they told me that I couldn't just keep taking classes. I had to be enrolled in a degree granting program. And so I applied for the Arabic MA. And so I pursued that MA and I finished it. And it was, I think, one of the most important decisions really I've made professionally and personally. I, could finally like read a whole novel in Arabic. I could read all this literature and particularly poetry in Arabic by, Mahmoud Darwish and Nizar Qabbani and all these very important, poets in the Arabic literary tradition. So that it's just carried me through, not just in the reading and writing, but just, being able to understand everything. And just, it was a personal goal. And I was just really thrilled I could do that. So in 2013, I graduated with my MA in Arabic language and literature from Georgetown. And my son was graduating on the same exact day with his BA from George Mason University. And he opted to come to my graduation. So we have some wonderful, wonderful pictures from that day. I felt that was a huge accomplishment for me and just personally so meaningful. Soon after that, I decided I would leave Georgetown. I had done what I needed to do. And I was offered a really interesting position with Qatar Foundation International, which was building I wouldn't call it a museum, but it was really an educational space in the middle of DC.
So Zeina, I just wanted to point out, first of all, I wish you were still at Georgetown because I teach there now. So I teach there. I'm glad that you were there, but I'm a little sad that you're not there anymore. If you don't mind, I want to just go back for the audience a little bit regarding 1948, with when your parents had to obviously escape because of what happened. And there was a story that really resonated with me and kind of hit home, is where you saw, or your parents saw rather, a neighbor in a pool of blood. And at the same time, they had to figure out which door or which exit they should take to leave and flee. Can you just, because that's, you probably heard that from both your parents. I mean, how did you receive that? I mean, that's just, it's so deep and hurtful.
I mean, this is something that my parents had told me that they experienced in Haifa before they fled. And again, they fled with, very little and with the key, the iconic key. My parents didn't talk a lot about the war. It was not something they really wanted to talk about. But I did have some stories like that from them. And it really and it wasn't just the stories, it was their feelings, the things how they would react to things, how they would react to the news. So it just built for me a real narrative, a real family narrative about dispossession and displacement that I think became very, very deep for me. And I think that's why I, write a lot of poetry about that particular experience. One time, Saad Amiri was writing a book and interviewing a lot of people from Palestine, from the Nakba time. And she and my mother met. And she happened to be in town when my mother was in town here in DC. And we set up a time for her to actually sit down and interview my mother. And the night before the interview, my mother just sort of fell apart. She had palpitations. She had anxiety, and she just didn't want to do this interview. She didn't want to re-experience all the things in her past. I think she wanted to just put it away. So I think that's why I don't have a lot of stories, but that is definitely one of them. They talked about how they had to flee, and it was very scary. And they had a 2-year-old in their arms who, they had to take care of. So yeah, I forget where I mentioned that. Ed, I don't know where you read that, but yeah, I mentioned it in some interview somewhere.
Yeah, no, for sure. It was just so impactful. And I just wonder, as I look at through the trajectory of your career and your life, how much has that influenced the direction that you've gone into? And obviously it influences your poetry. The other question I really wanted to know is, when you arrived to the US, you were 10 years old. What was that exact, like, and you said, was it Iowa or Idaho? I'm sorry.
Iowa.
Little bit different than where you were, obviously, right?
Yes.
How did you react when you first got there? Did you immediately feel like an outsider?
Well, I very much felt like an outsider, of course. We first came to stay with my aunt, my father's sister, Amti, in Connecticut. We stayed with her for a few days, and then we drove, across the country. We stayed at my uncle in Pennsylvania at that time for a few days, and then we made it to Iowa. And it was so cold. It was November. I had never experienced, so much cold. In fact, I have a poem about that too. It was very, you just feel different. People couldn't pronounce our names. My poor brother Fatih, nobody could pronounce his name. And finally, the principal in this little town in Iowa asked, well, what does it mean? And he said, well, it means like victor, victorious. And so people started calling him Victor. And for the longest time, my brother was known as Victor. It wasn't until he graduated high school that he didn't want to do that anymore, and he went back to being called Fatih. But it was just like we were sort of an oddity, right? Luckily, I already knew English. We learned it in Beirut, starting in first grade. But it's one thing to study it, and it's another thing to actually be immersed in it and to really speak it. And I remember having a very hard time with learning math and science in English. It was just these terms, and it was just hard for me. But, I managed. And in fact, amazingly, I knew English so well because I had to learn it. I had to learn, what a verb was and what a object, direct object, etc. That when I took the Iowa tests in Iowa, I did the best in my class. I was, 10 years old. I remember the teacher coming in completely stupefied by the results, and she made me stand up, and they gave me a standing ovation in the class. So, this is how, when you learn a language methodically, it's very different from people who just, it's organic for them. It's all around. We had experiences of feeling like outsiders often. And, after I remember coming back, when we were in when we were in New York, upstate, people would say, oh, you're Palestinian. Where's your gun? There was just a lot of, you would often get these kinds of messages, sort of. Yeah. So that we did have that. Absolutely. And I think it was a different time then. Although it's becoming really hard for immigrants here now, too. It has been, right? It's not becoming, it's always been. But it's more overt now.
Yeah, I remember when I was growing up, it was, that's the first time I had heard camel jockey or somebody call me sand or whatever it may be. So, and I was born here, so I can't imagine the feeling coming completely from a different country.
Yeah. And, we came here, I was so young that I eventually lost my accent. But they say that if you come, before age 13, 14, then it's easy to lose your accent. But I'm the only one in my family who doesn't really have an accent in English. Everybody else has a strong accent in English. So, yeah, I don't know how much it has helped me fit in, but it's, for the longest time, I was kind of, I didn't know where I belonged. I had a foot in both worlds. And after a while, I really realized how enriching it is to have both cultures, right? And to have both languages, and how It helps you really understand the people on the margins. I mean, I think it's helped me so much in all of my work, political work and personal work, both in Palestine and in the work I do here in Alexandria. My first poetry book is called Beina, in between, which means, Beina means between, right? So it's all about being between languages, between home and exile, between, youth and older age. I mean, we all have a lot of in-betweens, I think, in our lives.
Absolutely. It's amazing. As you were talking, I have so many connections and had so many, questions, and I could talk to you forever about everything you've done in your life. I think for me, listening to you and sort of going through both your poetry and your life in general, it seems that there are a couple of important connections, which is, and you talk about that in your book, but you also mention it here, which is the bicultural, bilingual view of the world that is bewildering, enriching, and beautiful at the same time. That's a quote from your book. And you definitely mentioned this quote, but you also express it in a way talking about your refugee past and your immigrant current. But also how important language is. We talked about Fateh and the name switching from Victory back to Fateh, and and the stories of your parents and grandparents. And I think I wonder, and your poetry, of course, has to do a lot with Palestine, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. Where was that connection? When did you start writing poetry? Like where did that the switch flip, if you will, from internalizing? So, and I love this. I actually wrote this down. You said poetry gives you permission to be vulnerable. So when was that transition from feeling vulnerable internally, who you are, where you came from, to translating that into poetry?
That's a great question, Zeina. I always written poetry. I remember writing poetry in my teen years. I remember riding my bicycle to the library, to the local library, and just going to the poetry aisle when I was like 13 and 14, 15, and just sort of sitting on the cool floor and, pulling books from the shelves and reading all these poems. So I started writing when I was a teenager, honestly. So it's always been with me in my life, the writing, but it's always been just this thing that I did that was on my own, right? It was something that I did that was private. And I think I started really making it a priority in my life in the early 2000s. I realized that, I really needed to express. I needed to give some, voice to my feelings. And so I started taking workshops, actually. I started taking classes, poetry classes and workshops. And they were all, nighttime things because I was working and I had 2 kids. And so it was something that I did on the side, but I really wanted to do it. And I started, producing some poems and getting some feedback, and started submitting them to literary journals. And then some of them would get accepted and a lot of them would get rejected. You have to have a thick skin when you're doing this stuff. But it helped me move forward. And so by the time I actually published my first book, Beina, in between, it was 2021. It was a long time. But by then I had a whole bunch of poems that were published already in literary journals. And so I was able to collect those poems and add to them and put together this book. And then my second book, Some Things Never Leave You, was in 2023. And that was a longer collection as well. And some of them were older poems as well, not the same ones as in my first book. But so I think, I just needed to, I think part of it is that whole experience of being in between and my parents' narrative of Palestine and dispossession. I actually got divorced in 2011. And I wrote a lot of poems about that experience. It's like poetry can do so much. Why do we write? I talk about this actually in workshops that I do. We write to express ourselves. We write to communicate to other people how we're feeling. We write to maybe push people to act in certain ways, right? Like the whole Arab Spring, during that, we had that poem by Al-Shabi, if a people, and so, people were actually using that poem to express. This was a poet whose words we were using to express ourselves, asking for change and galvanizing others to push for that change. And so, but like you said, I also realized that, being a poet and writing poetry really does give you that permission, as you were saying, to inhabit that space of being vulnerable. And it's okay, because I feel like a lot of in my life, I'm just a very sensitive person, and I am in that space, and I am vulnerable, but writing poetry can express that to me, and it gives me that feeling like I can do this. It's important. And I also have found others who are like that, right? Other poets who inhabit that same space. And when I read my poetry to others, it kind of elicits that vulnerability from them as well. If you'd like, I could read you that poem I mentioned about when we first came to the US.
I would love that. That would be amazing.
Would you like?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just find it. It's called Immigrant, actually. Immigrant. I grew up eating cheese with bitter olives, sesame and thyme-infused olive oil on warm bread. Names in my family all meant something, like lifelong challenges. Beautiful, splendid, victorious, forgiving. In my childhood books, words flowed from right to left. Direction didn't matter then. At 10, we traveled east to west against time. I gained 7 hours of youth, lost my compass. In New York, no sea to swallow the sun each day. Foods were sweet in America. People spoke as fast as they walked. Everything was large. Washing machines, supermarkets, even bananas and red grapes. We settled in this vast, cold place with neither boots nor a sense of how to be warm. Snowfalls were beautiful and cruel. The freezing air slapped our faces each morning. Inside, there was a smell of garlic and onions on the stove, loud talking over the phone with relatives overseas. My family inhaled and exhaled politics like cigarettes all the time. We blamed the British, the Americans, Arab leaders, Zionists, communists, or a history that was simply unkind. The TV in the background reported news in a language we spoke, but did not really understand. All this over a good meal, always, as if the hunger was in our bellies and not in our hearts.
Wow.
That's powerful. I gotta ask, we gotta get you on audiobooks, because your voice, the flow and the power of your words is just on another level.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's awesome. That's kind of you to say that. Actually, people say that to me all the time, and I would like to. I love reading poetry, whether it's mine or somebody else's. But yeah, somebody suggested to me that my later book, Some Things Never Leave You, that I should put that on an audiobook.
Absolutely.
I think I could be mistaken. Your favorite quote is by Mahmoud Darwish, right? Every beautiful poem is an act of resistance. I'm just curious, as you started to write poetry, when did you know your writing was in fact an act of resistance?
I mean, I think, yeah, I didn't get that quote till later after I was been writing for a while, but I think, everybody has a story. And when people want to talk politics about Palestine, you can have, disagreements or big discussions. But when you write about your own story, when you write about your experience, nobody can take that away from you. And so you can talk about your experience. You can talk about your family. You can talk about your mother and father and bring up all these things that are so important to bring up about dispossession, about being a refugee, and about growing old as a refugee. And nobody can really attack you for that, right? Like when you write a political article, that's one thing. But when you're writing poetry about your experiences, about how you're feeling, about your own personal trajectory, And so to me, that's resistance. That's an act of resistance, right? It's a way to really, amplify voices that we may not have when we're doing political analysis and, all that kind of thing. So, and I'm not just talking about myself, I'm talking about all the different poets that we have. And, there's just some beautiful poetry right now with Lina Khalaf Tufaha, Fadi Judah, Maya Abul Hayat. I mean, there's just so much beautiful work, going on right now. And all of it, I think, is resistance. Resistance to the status quo, resistance to the injustices that we experience, resistance to, not wanting things to keep going the way they are, right? And so it's just, I think all of that these are acts of resistance.
But do you realize that you are inspiring a next generation of poets? Have you really recognized that yet?
I haven't really thought about that. I did think about it one time in my first book, because I wrote about being divorced in my book. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, should I have put that out there, as a woman and as an Arab woman, as a Palestinian? And the only, and I really had a little bit of a, traumatic moment after the book came out, thinking, oh my gosh, I really put this all out, right? And the only thing that saved me was, well, maybe there are other young women, Arab women, Palestinian women who have gone through this or are going through this, and maybe that will help them. That, this is, I've modeled something for them. I don't know, maybe that's a little too hubris for me, but that's the only thing that made me feel like, okay, maybe that was okay.
We need you to speak. No, please.
Well,
No.
Zeina, honestly, I mean, I really, to echo what Ed was saying, it's so profound for me and for other Palestinians and Arab and non-Arabs to see Palestinian women in spaces that, often we're not, or because our language is always marginalized in those spaces, and because language is resistance and poetry is resistance to prevent erasure, oftentimes documentation, and I think especially now, people seeing you as Poet Laureate of Alexandria, Virginia is huge. I remember when that announcement was made, I was ecstatic. I know so many people who were ecstatic to hear that you are all over the place in Virginia and elsewhere giving talks and being present, and your demeanor, your voice, the poetry that you write, and your vulnerability really brings people close to you. And it's okay. It shows people that it's okay to be vulnerable. And I think that has a huge impact on giving people the space to be themselves, despite all of it. So for whatever it's worth, just a quick nod of acknowledgement there.
I appreciate your words, both of you. I really do. I'm just very humble. I don't, I don't think about these things, but I have to say people do give me some, very positive feedback. And I've been, during this genocide, this current genocide in Gaza and now, Lebanon and Syria. I mean, it's just horrific. I've been asked a lot to read, to do readings, to read at vigils, to read at fundraisers. And I'm glad to use my voice in that way also. That's another example of poetry as resistance too, as you were asking, Ed.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that you do write about, poetry that's politically heavy, but also you write about the beauty. I remember there's one poem and you talk about the scents of the different spices and sort of, and it's beautiful. I think it was about being Arab, and it's a lovely poem. And I encourage everybody to dig into your work, because there's so much in there that not just to learn from, but to relate to, particularly for Arab Americans. And I wanted to, on the note of vulnerability and sort of being happy, and something that I know you love talking about, because, I'm a mother too, and not yet in your space as a grandmother, but tell us about your kids and now your grandkids. It's so, you light up when you speak about them. And I think it's so hear and see you do that.
Oh, that you're so sweet. Thank you. And if you'd like, I can read the spice poem later, if you, because that's a fun one.
Yeah.
And it's a little lighter, right? And so it's nice to have a little lighter poem sometimes. Of course, my children and my grandchildren are just, the lights of my life. And I am so lucky that both my daughter and my son live not too far away from me. So I actually get to see them and spend time with them. And my daughter Lena has two children, and one is 1 year old and the other one is almost 4. So they're little guys and they're both boys. And so it's just so wonderful to be with them and to watch them grow. I'm proud of both of my children. My son Mark works in the IT field, and he's just doing very well. And my daughter Lena is a jazz vocalist, which is to me so interesting because here's jazz, such a quintessential American cultural music form, and my daughter, a Palestinian-American, is very well known in the jazz field, at least in the DC area. So, and it's fun to go and watch her perform. When my first grandson was born, I wrote an essay, maybe you'd like to hear it, about, it was during COVID, and it was during Black Lives Matter time. And he wasn't quite born yet, but I wrote this sort of letter to him, and it was published in a magazine. Would you like me to read it to you? Let me get it out.
Absolutely.
So both my daughter and her husband are musicians. And the title of the essay is Like a Song with Wings, Letter to My Yet to Be Born Grandson. And that was in October 2020. Soon I will meet you and call you Habibi, my love. It's amazing that you're growing every day in your mother's womb, that you carry our family in your bones and in your blood. A lovely thought. You carry us before we carry you. Your history starts with music. It was your father's trumpet and your mother's voice that brought the two of them together. Their love has enriched our beautiful family story. And I want to tell you that ours is also a sad story because your great-grandparents were refugees who were forced to flee their homes during the Nakba, the Palestinians' devastating catastrophe in 1948. They never could go back to live in Palestine and had a deep longing, haneen, for their homeland and angst about its loss until the day they died. I inherited this mantle and its responsibilities, and then your mother did too. It's in our bones and blood. You will learn that being Palestinian is at once a profound gift of history, culture, and identity, as well as a quest for justice, adala, printed in our core. As you get older, you may question, what does this have to do with me? These stories will have happened 3 generations ago for you. Please hold on to them. As you understand more, you will feel the connection, and you will get angry that so many members of your mother's family experienced such great dispossession. I hope that one day you will be able to say that peace with justice came to your great-grandparents' homeland. I used to hang a poster on my wall that said, Palestinians have human rights too. This was our cry that you could say is equivalent to Black Lives Matter. As a people wronged, imprisoned, impoverished, wounded, and killed, it was crucial to affirm that we matter, that our lives are important, that we have fundamental rights. And now, in this year that you will be born, we still feel we must make these assertions. The words Black Lives Matter circle around your mother and father, your house, and your neighborhood like a song with wings. These words are the bird that will save your generation. You might think there is such heaviness in all of this, a burden to carry throughout your life. Think of it as ni'mah, grace, that fills you with kindness. For me, being Palestinian has opened my eyes to appreciating other struggles. The Palestinian part of you will help you cultivate a heightened sensitivity to injustice. My dear grandson, the world will welcome you despite the current turmoil because there's always room for starting anew. You will remind us of the one abiding privilege we have, asserting our love and our presence with the blessing of a new birth. Habibi, I can't wait to carry you in my arms.
Wow.
Ah,
Amazing.
we need to talk to Andy Shalala, Busboys and Poets, and have a Zeina Azzam day.
You're so sweet.
As we all wipe tears from our eyes, I mean, this is
I know. I kind of sort of cry when I read some of these things. I've actually read a few times at Busboys and Poets, and I've, facilitated some sessions with poets there and stuff.
No, I want a whole day dedicated to you, to be clear.
It's amazing. Really, really amazing.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm really humbled and happy that my poetry resonates with you. Thank you.
Yeah, it does. And you spoke about your children. How cool was it that at your launch of the Some Things Never Leave You book, that they both stood up and spoke at the beginning? How did that feel? Like, for me, I would have just melted right there and I'm done. I'm going to retire.
Well, that's exactly what happened. I started to cry. I mean, I cry very easily anyway, but it meant so much to me that they, not only were they both there, but they both spoke, and they spoke from their hearts, and it was just lovely. And I had asked Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a poet I respect so much. She's just made she's influenced me, influenced my writing a lot, because she sort of opened up this whole idea that I can write about Palestine, I can write about my parents, and I can be sad, and I can be, proud, and all that stuff. And I love her poetry. So I had asked Naomi if she would send a paragraph to be read, and my daughter read it, and that was just so meaningful too. So she read that, and then she went on and said all sorts of just wonderful and very profound things. So yes, I did melt, Ed.
I believe it.
Yeah.
I believe it.
Zeina, I mean, your writing is so powerful. What's the process like? I mean, do you just sit down and write? Is there a specific time that you sit down and write? How does it happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Different poets and different writers approach writing very differently. I know people who wake up every morning really early before everybody else wakes up, and they sit for like 45 minutes and just write. I try to do that, and I don't do that. I can't do it. I just write when I am inspired to write. And that just can happen anytime, right? I could read something in the newspaper, or I could be sitting with a friend and talking, and they'll say something that just sort of just piques my, inspiration. And so I am not so prolific. I don't write all the time. I don't write a lot. But I have to say, once there's this nugget of writing, of a poem, then I just can't let go of it. I'm just constantly I get obsessed with it. I keep going back and back. And I also edit quite a bit. I change things. It takes me a while actually to finish a poem. But when it's finished, But yeah, I mean, if I can just write 1 or 2 poems a month, I'd be happy. I'm not just writing constantly. I'm really not. But there are times when I write more than other times. I wrote several poems about Gaza over the last few months, and now I'm having trouble writing about Gaza again. It's such a deep, hole in my heart. It's been harder to write now about Gaza.
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of Gaza, I know we mentioned, as we were talking earlier, you have a close friend in Gaza. Would you like to talk a little bit about him?
Yeah, I mean, actually, he's a close friend, but I've never met him, right? This is Ahmed. He's 28 or 29. Ahmed, I met through my volunteer work with We Are Not Numbers, which is a writing program for youth in Gaza. And I've actually been volunteering with them since 2016. So I've been doing this for quite some time. And what the administrators of We Are Not Numbers do is they take a writer from Gaza and they pair him or her with a mentor, either in the US or in Europe. And, they submit their poem or their story, their essay. And this is all in English. And we go back and forth, we edit, we discuss until we have sort of a final shaped piece of writing. And then it's published on the We Are Not Numbers website. It's just an amazing organization. And I don't have family in Gaza. So for me, it's just this opportunity and really a privilege to meet and get to know the youth voices from Gaza, And so over the years, there have been several who, you end up talking to more, you connect with more. And Ahmed was the one with whom I worked in the summer of 23 before October. And we worked on a couple of essays together and we just connected. We talked, I think, I don't know if it was on Zoom or whether on WhatsApp, but he started calling me mama, I mean, of course he has a mother and a father, but we had this sort of really nice connection. He's younger than my own son, And then October 7th happened. And so we kept our connection. And in the beginning, very few of the writers from We Are Not Numbers were writing because it's too much upheaval and war and everything. But now they're starting to write again more. And so I've done a couple of pieces with him. And actually, Ahmed writes for Middle East Eye. He's written for Mondowise and Electronic Intifada now too. But meanwhile, he sends me voice messages every 2 or 3 days. And Ahmed and his family are in the north. And so they have been, they're serving. I mean, they're just starving. And he tells me the details of what life is like for them. A couple of days ago, he sent me a voice message and saying that his lungs are really in bad shape because they make the fire inside the house, right, to cook. And they're using, pieces of wood from furniture or clothing or whatever. And so it's just really smoky and he's really having a hard time from that. So, I mean, I'm hearing these details that we don't hear, right? We don't know. He said, even when they're home, somebody can get shot or a bomb nearby or, whatever. His friend, his neighbor, that just happened to them. And so, it's just that for me, when I see that I have a message from Ahmed, he sends me the voice messages on Telegram. I just have to get into that space where I can actually listen to it because it's really hard to listen. But of course I listen and I listen more than once. And some of some of it has actually, inspired me to write some poems, some of the stuff that he sends me. They have little kids in his house, his sister and her family are there. And, they're just, I don't know I always worry about him. I'm constantly worried. I wake up in the middle of the night, I worry about him. And so I worry about all of Gaza, but Ahmed is like this representative to me of this connection, right? Of what's going on and the utter horrific, experiences that they're having. It's like a sadistic thing by the Israelis. I know, people tell me I shouldn't be shocked because this is what's happening, but I continue to be shocked. It's just shocking to me that the whole world is just allowing this to happen, especially the United States. But anyway, so yes, that's my connection with Ahmed and with We Are Not Numbers.
And I think that embodies it. What you just talked about with Ahmed is the We Are Not Numbers, right? It is the fact that we talk about the people of Gaza, we have 42,000 killed or 100,000 killed, or and it's the Ahmeds of the Gaza that we need to remember. It's everybody that is there as an individual, and I think that's a very profound thing to say because you are experiencing it firsthand. You have Ahmed to sort of remind you of that constantly, and I think it's a good reminder for all of us.
Absolutely, Zeina. I'm glad you said that. And it's like the perfect name of the organization. We Are Not Numbers. And this organization has been, going on for a while, and they've gone through several attacks on Gaza, several wars on Gaza. And by the way, I am actually mentoring other people besides him now. I'm in the middle of mentoring this one a poem, but the last one was titled Under the Rubble. I mean, it's just, it's important for these young people to express what's going on and to have their voices people hearing them.
And a lot of your writings are about sort of this duality that we're living. Are we Palestinian Arab or are we Americans, right? And I think that exists within your writing. I think, let me try to ask this correctly. Does what's happening right now with the genocide make you put that into more question, or do you feel a sort of dissonance between the two worlds more than before? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I feel so much, cognitive dissonance with the fact that my tax money is being used to kill and maim and displace and destroy Palestinians. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible feeling. I know we all feel it. So yes, there's a lot of dissonance. And I feel, that my Palestinian identity has always been in the forefront. But it's even more so now. I mean, even just talk to neighbors who have nothing to do with Palestine or the Arab world, and they'll ask me how I am. And I always say, well, I'm okay, but the genocide in Gaza, it's awful. I mean, I just bring it up everywhere I can. And I'm actually active in Alexandria with local politics. And then we have it's not so new anymore. It's a year old, an organization called Alexandria for Palestinian Human Rights. And we've done a lot of work in terms of trying to get a ceasefire resolution with our city council, which we failed. And now we're talking about divestment and talking to the Human Rights Commission. So in the past, I mean, I've always been an activist for Palestinian work in all different ways with We Are Not Numbers. And, I've worked with other charitable organizations. I worked with Growing Palestine to support farmers. And, even cultural stuff. I'm an advisor for the Museum of the Palestinian People. So I've always done this work, but it hasn't really been in Alexandria. And now it's here. It's all around me here, which I'm really grateful for. I'm grateful there's this group of people who felt like came out of nowhere, who are local to my community, who support Palestinian rights. And it's been wonderful in many ways.
Zeina, I think for me, I've been more recently very much engaged on the K through 12 work, and I think you in Virginia. Of course, we're both in Virginia, and you've talked about this earlier when you were talking about your work with Georgetown and how you would go to the schools and teach about Arab Americans or Arab culture and Muslim culture. It's so, I can tell you, since the genocide, it's been the attack on the K through 12, as well as the universities. Of course, university campuses has been extreme. Kids have been prevented from wearing the colors of the flag, even the map, and you having been in those spaces before October 7th and have worked on educating people, including educators, right, on how to talk about Arab culture and the Arab world and Palestinians and that is so important right now. And the presence of such an institution like that exists in Georgetown that you have worked for is so important. Can you talk a little bit about how the differences between that time and how it is now in terms of sort of the educational perspective? Was it easy then to talk about Arab world and Palestinians, or easier? Was it celebrated as a cultural diversity versus now we are all having to defend our existence, essentially?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Zeina. I mean, back then, it's not that it was easy, not at all. We were attacked a lot. We had, in the media, and people came to campus and, made their negative voices against us. And in fact, I used to, with the workshops, I would hold I think 4 workshops a year and then a week-long workshop in the summer. I remember one time this woman who was from New York, she said she was she was in town and she teaches at NYU or something as an adjunct, and could she attend my workshop? And so I said yes. And then she wrote this scathing article about me and about my outreach program. And it was syndicated across a few sort of Jewish American newspapers. And she was basically saying that I was pushing Islam in, a terrorist version of Islam. I can't really remember all, but she pushed this whole ridiculous narrative about me and my program. And it had zero, association with reality of and it was amazing to me. And then, we had issues within the university. The one department was really upset with us, and I had to go through all this stuff. I had to go through the university communications department. And they basically said to me, don't do anything, And so that's what happened. And, and maybe they were right, because the whole thing sort of died very slowly. But we had a lot of issues. We had this thing we called the enemies file, and it was very thick. We'd get all sorts of emails. But at the same time, having said that, the program was open to teachers, and many of them were self-identified. I mean, they came to the workshop because they wanted to learn more. So there was usually a real openness that I found among the teachers, which was really wonderful. And there was this, group of teachers who came to everything that I did. So I think there was a lot of receptivity at the same time. And then when 9/11 happened, there was an outpouring of interest in Islam. And, I guess that was the only silver lining of 9/11. But I remember thinking, I'm so glad we are established as a center and people know us, because they knew where to come. And so after 9/11, I did a whole lot of workshops. I did a lot of people. I would send students to the schools and sometimes faculty to teacher, like in service, trainings about Islam. I mean, everybody wanted to learn about Islam at that time. And it was good. It was important to do that. But I also always had in the back of my mind that I wanted people to understand that the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world were not a region of conflict. It's like that's how everybody thought of our area of the world. And so I always, even though I would have a workshop on, the war in Lebanon or the war, whatever, on Gaza or Palestinians, I would always have also workshops on Arab music, about Islamic art, literature and poetry. And, I had a lot of historical topics as well. And so I worked, I had stuff about women, Arab women. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that people understood sort of the totality, that they have a more expansive view of this region that we're talking about, So I think I went on a tangent in answering your question.
There's no such thing. It's a podcast. Go on tangents. We love them. It exposes. So oftentimes this is where we get the best out of people, is when it's not intended to answer a question. So it's lovely.
You're right, Zeina. This is so important right now. The K through 12 outreach and talking to students and talking to teachers. I think. And I'm not doing it right now, not in a very specific sense in the Arab world, but I have been doing a lot of poetry in the middle schools and high schools in Alexandria, actually, as part of my being Poet Laureate. And a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to do a couple of days of workshops for students in our international academy, who are actually all students who have come here recently, who are learning English, who come from all different areas of the world. And it was really kind of nice for me to connect with them as an immigrant myself, right? They looked up to me in that way, and this is what their teachers told me. And I'm always introduced as a Palestinian American, and in that school and all the schools and everything I do. And whenever I do poems for Alexandria, when I'm asked to write original poems for particular historic commemorations, I'm always introduced by the mayor. And my bio is very much, Zeina Azzam is a Palestinian-American, blah, blah, blah. And so I feel like just everybody knowing that there's a Palestinian in their midst. I mean, we're at this stage, right? That a Palestinian in their midst who is, participating in society, who's part of the community. I think that itself is a real plus, right? And I've found that also have come, like a couple of city council members have wanted to ask me about Palestine, right? So it's the education could happen anywhere. But specifically for the schools, I think it's very important.
And I want to give you a shout out too, because I know you come from a Christian family, and here you are being the greatest ally, and you're demonstrating that Palestinians are Muslim and Christians, and you're literally defending us to an extent as an ally and sort of protecting some of our literature and our art. Do people recognize that at all? Or because I'm going to recognize it here, but do people recognize that?
I mean, people do or have in the past. The woman who infiltrated my workshop and, talked about me as a Muslim, whatever, pushing Muslim terrorist ideas, had no idea that I was Christian. It was kind of funny. And I had just also worked as the assistant director for a program for teachers in New Mexico called Dar al-Islam. And I was the assistant director of this whole program about Islam, about teaching teachers about Islam. I grew up with very much a secular family. And we were my father was a big Arab nationalist. And, it was, to us, the religion was a secondary thing. We were Arabs, we were Palestinians. And so I've always held that close to me. And I always feel very, comfortable in a society that has different religions and different races and different ethnicities, but particularly in our society where it's Muslim and Christian. Yeah.
I feel it oftentimes softens the blow. It's unfortunate, but honestly, I mean, sometimes in conversation, it stumps people. Wait, there's Christian Palestinians? What? And it truly, and even if you're not, even if you're secular, even if it's just a topic of conversation, it sort of shocks people into thinking, and that's part of the bigotry and the racism that we have, the sort of the narrow-mindedness of the situation, and also because there's not enough education, public education about the Arab world in general, and so you run some things like this. So I think your presence in those spaces as a Palestinian, and whenever invoked the Christian Palestinian aspect of it, I face it too. It's an interesting conversation to have. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it helps you. I think one of the biggest themes that I pushed when I was working at Georgetown in the education program is that there's diversity in the Arab world. Mm-hmm. And we're not monolithic. We're not all this or that. And so, when somebody finds, I don't say it up front that I'm Christian, but if it comes up in the conversation, it helps to sort of open that conversation about the diversity in the Arab world.
And I mean, just a little glimpse in Jerusalem, in the old city, we have Armenians, we have Christians, we have Muslims, and the beautiful diversity of it is lovely. And the Armenian part always is forgotten. We do have Armenian Palestinians as well.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Ed?
Yeah.
Now, I was going to ask, this is a dumb question, but what does a poet laureate do, and how does that happen? Because you have a term for 3 years, is that right?
Yes. So it's not a dumb question at all. People ask me that all the time. And I think, and being poet laureate is different in different cities and localities. So basically, I am asked to write specific poems, like original poems for some historic commemorations. And some of these have been kind of challenging, actually, because Alexandria has a terrible history in terms of civil rights, and the Black community and enslavement. And we commemorate 2 lynchings every year that happened in the 1890s. And I was asked my first month of being poet laureate to write a poem for one of those commemorations. And it was really hard, but I read a lot of the history and was able to write something that resonated for people. And then I had to do it again a few months later for the second lynching commemoration. But there are other commemorations that they asked me to do. We have a Freedmen's Cemetery, which is also another Civil War kind of thing. And I had to write about the people who are buried there who crossed into Alexandria from the south and basically crossed into freedom because it was Union territory at that time. We have a jazz festival every summer, and I'm asked to read there. And I actually have been writing jazz poems the last couple of years. And at 9/11 this year, they asked me to do an original poem for 9/11. So I did that. So those are the poems that I have to write. Also, there's every summer we have the Alexandria birthday party. So it happens right after July 4th. And this year we had the 275th anniversary of Alexandria. So I had to write this big poem for that. It happens at the river and it's like thousands of people. So I read in front of thousands of people now, which is, a very new experience. As I mentioned earlier, I go into the schools and do some poetry work. And I'm asked to do 2 poetry workshops every year. So in fact, I have one tomorrow. I'm doing a workshop on writing poetry about loss and grief.
Like, where was my invite, Zeina?
I have an opening if you want to go. So I try to do workshops on topics that are important to me. And, because of what's going on in Gaza and the genocide, it just felt like, writing poetry about loss and grief is the right thing for me right now. Cause I feel like whatever I do, it has to resonate with me in my poetry. And so I do have to do those workshops. And then I also judge poetry there's a K through 12 or 1 through 12 poetry contest in the Alexandria City Public Schools. And I judge that with 2 other judges. And there used to be a poetry contest within the jail, within the detention center here in Alexandria. And they asked me to judge those poems as well. So, and then I'm just asked to come and do readings in different places. It doesn't pay much. I get $1,000 a year. So this is very much not something you want to do to make money. It's just very much something that you do because it's meaningful to you. And it has been a wonderful experience. I feel very honored, honestly. And I feel like I've learned a lot. I've grown a lot. And I hope I've contributed, well to the community.
That's amazing. Zeina, you said something I'm really intrigued now because you mentioned that you judged poetry from prison. And I think this is so powerful because it's often when we think of prisons, and I'm not going to go off on a tangent here for abolishing prisons, but we, as Palestinians, we are so used to talking about Palestinians being in prison and as political prisoners, and how often both song and poetry comes out of prison in such a powerful way. Do you feel that there is a connection? I mean, and I know each experience is very different, but how does it feel? Why is it important to you to be in that space? How does it feel to be in a space where, you're working with prisoners who are behind bars and able to express themselves linguistically, I guess, in poetry?
Yeah, I mean, these are voices that none of us hear, really. Certainly not in Alexandria. These are, people are very much marginalized. I actually toured the prison. The sheriff took us and showed us, it's not a prison, it's a jail. It's not a very long-term kind of thing. And it's, and the conditions are much different from the conditions of prisoners in Palestine, of course. But, you can't help but think about incarceration and its place in society and, how prisoners are treated. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say, Zeina.
Is the poetry that they write about where they are usually? Or is it more sort of expansive?
It's very much about where they are and how they're placed in society and how they are disenfranchised. It's very much about that. There was one year when this man, I wish I could have met him, but he wrote these incredible haiku about his experience, but about just life and, and justice. And I picked his haiku. He had like 6 of them. I picked them as the finalists. But yeah, some of them are so engaged and, real profound thinkers.
Where are they publicly available for people to read as well? Or is it just, no?
No, it was just very much an internal thing.
I see. Yep.
And hopefully he's out of there by now. I don't know. Yeah. And they didn't do the contest this year, so I don't know if they're doing it anymore, but I did it the first 2 years that I was Poet Laureate. It's such an interesting experience, to hear these voices.
Definitely.
Do you recognize, that's why I sort of asked you about Alexandria. Obviously, we know their history with racism and so on and so forth. There's a Palestinian-American serving in this position now in Zeina Azzam. Has that registered with you? I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
It's something that I have to negotiate because when I'm still politically active, and it's been, I haven't allowed myself to like not say things or not write things, right? I need to say and write what I need to say and write. But I know there have been some murmurings about me being a poet laureate and, writing stuff about Palestine and about injustice, right? And at first I had, this anxiety about someone, I don't know, they can dig up stuff from your past, but I don't really have anything in the past that could be used against me. But, people make stuff up and can really thwart your work. And so I actually worried for a while that somebody was going to say something or do something to get me to take me out of this position, but it hasn't happened. I did have to, or not, I was invited to read poetry at the United Nations in May for the Nakba commemoration their second Nakba commemoration. And it was an incredible experience for me, an incredible honor to be at the United Nations and to do that. But I found out later, one of the city council members told me that somebody had complained. Is it appropriate for our poet laureate to be doing this? So I've had to deal with this kind of stuff, and I think I have a good enough reputation and rapport with the people in Alexandria that they know that what I'm doing is important and credible and shouldn't be used against me. But there are people who say stuff and who want you not to succeed, right? And I said to the city council member, I said, the poet laureate right before me is African American, and had she been invited to give a talk at the NAACP or something like that, would people have reacted the same way? I said, you guys should be proud of me. And I was like, one time when I actually thought of on my feet, I actually said something
yeah.
And so I felt that was important. And she agreed with me, actually. She did. She was supportive. But then I thought afterwards, honestly, why did she even tell me all this, right? Is it to tell me just to say, well, I'm supporting you? Or is it to say to me, people are watching you? So I don't know, So these are things that I've had to think about and deal with. Fortunately, I feel respected. I feel like I haven't had any issues. But it's an ongoing story.
You've actually been in situations, though, where you were asked to give a talk, I think, for a demonstration, if I read that correctly, and you had to change your name or cover your name because white supremacists were looking for people right? Is that right?
Yeah, they were doxing people. It was, when was it? It was a while ago. And it was just when Rashida Tlaib was elected, because I remember I said something about her in my speech. But yeah, there was, we were told there was a special communication with all the speakers that we were going to be doxed, that we should wear sunglasses and that we should maybe wear a hat. And they just used my first name. They just didn't use my last name. I didn't change my name. I just used my first name. But yeah, there was a real paranoia at that time. And, I felt it too, but everybody had to do it. Yeah.
And it's amazing because juxtaposed against now, where, it's very similar, where the kids now are initially started covering so that nobody will know who they are, but now everybody's out in the open. It's amazing how just being Palestinian makes you a target. Our existence is literally threatening to Zionists and those who are ignorant. So, our presence as Palestinians in those spaces that, like we said earlier, that typically don't have Palestinians in and of itself is a form of education, like you mentioned. So, yeah, and it's really powerful how we've moved from a space where just a few people were doing that and covering themselves and trying to stand up for Palestine, and now in the streets. How do you feel about this? We're in the heart of the movement, but also in the belly of the beast, right? Washington, D.C.
Yes.
I've seen you at almost every single protest that I've been at, and you're very active, not just in your voice, you're very active in presence as well. Is that helpful for you? Going through what we're going through, does it help emotionally? Is it, empowering?
I mean, it's empowering in that to see the solidarity, right? That's what's really empowering, is that we have so much solidarity around us, so many people who support us. And that's the beautiful part, really. But it's also like, I mean, I've been doing this for so long. I mean, I've been, we're talking about, I mean, I know I started with Vietnam War in the 70s, but, the whole early 80s and onwards, I've been to so many, it's like I almost can recycle some of these, what I hold as my sign. So it feels wearing, it's like this, we're constantly asking for the same thing, demanding the same thing. We're constantly trying to educate. But, I mean, I just feel like we have to just keep going. This is particularly a difficult time right now with Trump coming. But we can't stop, we really can't stop. And I think about my children, I think about my grandchildren and the kind of world that they're going to be living, that they are living in. We just can't stop. But it is so difficult. I mean, in my heart, I'm just, I wake up in the middle of the night and I worry. I worry about Ahmed. I worry about, what the next 4 years is going to be like. I worry about what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon. I mean, it is just so much worry. I don't know. I don't want to personalize it. I'm just so small in terms of what everybody else is experiencing in Palestine. But so it like, to answer your question, it is empowering in a sense, but it's also just very heavy. I feel it's very, very heavy for all of us.
So I want to go back, if you're okay with it, to your work at Georgetown and the Qatar Foundation. And that it sort of fascinates me because here you are in these positions of administration, if you will, and obviously education. Yet you have this underlying superpower of writing and poetry. When you were going through your career, did you ever say, you know what? I know we have to pay bills, obviously, right? Right. But did you ever say, you know what? I wish I could just stop working at the Qatar Foundation or stop working at Georgetown and just do this?
I think I'm just too practical to even be thinking that way. But yeah, I mean, I've dreamed that it would be nice to be able to do something like that. That job that I started with Qatar Foundation, is Qatar Foundation International, which is the one here in DC, was supposed to, build this immersive museum educational space for students mostly and adults to learn about Arab world and Islam, which was kind of an extension of the work I did at Georgetown, right? This is why they were interested in me. And I only worked there like 4 months, and then the Qataris decided to take away the funding and they killed the project. So, but then I stayed there in another capacity in the work for infusing Arabic language learning in K through 12 curricula across the country. So at least I was still doing something that was meaningful to me. But I never thought about my writing as my superpower. And that was, I love that you said that.
It absolutely is. Do you mind, are you comfortable with letting me know why the Qatar Foundation took away the funding?
It was a mystery. And I still don't really know what happened because they had put a lot of money. We'd put a couple of $1 million into it already. We had a space and everything. And then I think something happened politically in Doha that just shuffled priorities and budgets and decided to kill this project. They didn't kill the entire foundation. The foundation continued, but it was that particular project that I was in charge of that was deleted. And it was really a very, I was very down about it. I was very upset about the whole thing. So, but, I moved on.
Speaking of superpowers, we have looked through so many of your poems, and I think discussing which ones to read, which ones to recommend is just, it's too hard. And I know earlier we wanted to give you the space to narrate one of your amazing poems. And I think, first of all, I'm going to do two parts here. So one, what is next for you? What's next for Zeina? And then after we're done, I would love it if you can read the poem Immortal Sea, Your Sea, and
Okay.
Father.
Well, first of all, I am just so, it's that the two of you read several of my poems, you've read about me. I mean, that's so, I don't know how I feel about that. I feel grateful, of course, but it's not everybody has that experience. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for being so positive and uplifting my experiences, which are very personal to me. But I appreciate that you appreciate them. So I wanted to make sure I said that. As for what did you have? Was a question, Zeina?
What's next for you, Zeina? Yeah, what's next? Where can we follow you on social media as well? But what's next for you? What's next?
Yeah, so my term as Poet Laureate ends in April of 2025. So I have another 5 months or so. And after that, I've actually sort of retired from my full-time, 9 to 5 work. So I'm able now, to just do my thing, right? So I've found that over the last 3 years, I've been doing a lot of stuff for Alexandria as Poet Laureate, but actually, a lot of other people have invited me to do things for them and to write things and that have nothing to do with Alexandria. So I feel like, or at least I'm hoping that will continue, right? And of course, Palestine's going to continue, so, like hopefully in a better direction. But there's always going to be things to do for Palestine, and so I will continue my political work and my engagement in the organizations and with We Are Not Numbers. So so I don't really know what exactly I'll be doing. I don't really think of it as April will come and my life will change completely. I think April will come and I'll just sort of move forward and see what happens. I'll keep writing. I'd like to do another poetry collection. So I'd like to just have, having to write the poems for Alexandria has taken a lot of my energy and my creativity. And I'm happy for that. I'm happy with the poems that I've written, but it's taken away from the poems that I want to write. So I'm really looking forward to just having that space and the time to just do the poems that I want to focus on. So I can't tell you anything specific that I'm going to be doing that's different. I think I want to do more of the same. It just maybe not have the pressures of having to write.
I think one more thing you're going to be doing a lot of, because every single time I call or text you, you're with your grandkids or with your daughter. I'm pretty sure you're going to have a lot more time for grandkids moving forward, Zeina, for sure.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, they're both in daycare, but so I don't see them much during the week, but I do go over there most weekends. And I really want to be involved in their lives. My parents didn't live near me, so they were not involved in my own children's lives, not in a steady, way. And I really want to keep doing that. And I want to be a support to my daughter and her husband. And maybe, inshallah, my son and his wife will have, but of course I don't ask. They can do what they need to do. But they live nearby too. So, but yeah, of course, then I'll definitely be spending more time with my family, which means the world to me.
And Zeina, on this transition, talking about family, we would be honored if you would share your poem, Immortal Sea, Your Sea, about your father.
Thank you. This is a new poem about my father, so it's in neither one of my books. And I was Lina Khalaf Tufaha, who is a poet I admire greatly. She was invited to curate a poetry collection for Prairie Schooner, which is an old magazine in the United States, but they have this online thing called the Fusion issue, and each month or 2 months they do a new collection on this issue, and they actually asked her to curate something about Palestine, and she chose the whole theme of archive And so it was kind of an interesting theme. So she sent an email out to like her whole list, and it went all over the place, and asked people to send poems about this theme. And so I sent this poem, and I was so happy she chose it. And of course, the editors at Prairie Schooner too. And this poem just, means a lot to me. I've written about both my parents, and so this one is dedicated to my father. Immortal sea, your sea. You taught me how to hold the fishing rod, feel the tugs, and it took all of my small body to hold onto you and the rod as we stood on the Beirut shore. Sometimes you would choose a spot on the slippery rocks that jutted out to sea to get closer to the bass and bream. Those days I learned what sabr was, watching you take in the unending distances with your eyes, the patience of waiting. There was tenderness in your casting dance, a longing as you moved your body toward the horizon. A line of poetry would often emerge from your lips, something about how to live with dignity, search for pearls in the sea, appreciate the power of the pen over the sword. It seemed on those days that whether the fish found you didn't matter. Had you had your way with what your life should have been like without the war, the Mediterranean would have been the cradle of everything you dreamed. You taught all of us to swim, to submerge our head, not to be afraid of the salt and the vast airless space. I was hypnotized by the motion of your arms as you swam in the depths parallel to shore, following a line that was infinite yet close. In Haifa, you had owned ships and traded in cargo between the countries that shared the same expanse of blue until the World War halted your dreams. Then the Nakba put your relatives on boats going northward, and it was the Mediterranean again that witnessed your woes. The sea became the archive of your losses. So when we moved to Beirut, you tried to reimagine it as a chronicler, a place of reflection, wondrous and generous and deep. It was where you could bring your family to picnic and frolic on Sundays, dig in the sand to reach the water below. You could invoke the other meaning of sea, the bahr that referred to meter in classical Arabic poetry, a lovely convergence. You relished reciting the couplets of Al-Mutanabbi and Shawqi, but later with our beloved Darwish, you saw the bahr ebbing, the structure giving way to unrhymed, free verse, your history unhinged, taken apart, regrouped. Maybe we should have scattered your ashes over the sea, the poetry of your being going back to where it belongs. You would have been one with the fish and the boats, the rocks and sand and waves, sabr, memories, and loss. We could have then visited you and touched Palestine everywhere in your immortal sea.
I can't think of a better way to end the podcast. Zeina, it's been an absolute privilege. Thank you so much. Zeina 2.0, we have to take Zeina 1.0 out to dinner or lunch at some point.
Absolutely. Zeina, thank you so much for being here with us.
It's been really wonderful to talk to you and, to tell you about my life, which is not something I'm used to doing. But thank you. Thank you for welcoming my narrative, welcoming my story, and welcoming my ideas. And thank you for doing this amazing podcast. Beautiful. Thank you both.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.